Bang! Neeves Knives. I'm Jared, and this is a subject about behind the edge thickness and grinds that I've honestly never heard discussed before. I've never discussed it, I don't believe, on this channel before, but I want to get into it because I do think it's somewhat important. So, blade geometry and geometry itself, the thickness of the grind, right? However thick the blade stock is relative to how thin it is behind the edge based on how tall it is. So basically the slope of which it drops down from the thickness of the spine down to the very tip of the edge. Okay. Now, when you look at a factory edge, so factory edges from the factory are usually, this isn't for all companies, but usually around 22.5 degrees to 25 degrees. And I'm talking about the edge bevel of which a knife is sharpened, the edge angle right here, that shiny part. So that on that side and that side. So usually from the factory, an edge bevel, the angle of which the edge is sharpened at, the angle that the edge is sharpened at is usually about 22.5 to 25 degrees. Now, depending on how thick that is behind the edge, right? And the angle they sharpen it at depends on how big the bevel's going to be. So the lower the angle, meaning like 15 degrees, is going to be a bigger edge bevel than, say, 20 degrees. So 20 degrees will be a smaller edge bevel. Your edge will look smaller. 15 degrees will make it look bigger. You will also get better cutting geometry out of a lower angle. Now, when we measure thickness behind the edge from a factory knife, a lot of times it's like 25 degrees per side, and we're measuring the thickness behind the edge. But the thickness behind the edge might come out to be like 10 thousandths behind the edge, or 12 thousandths, or 15 thousandths, or even 20 thousandths, whatever it is. We're not putting into account that edge bevel is such a high degree that when resharpened, you're automatically going to get a bigger edge bevel. Now, also, the geometry of the blade, all right, so if it's a thick blade, when you put a new edge on it, depending on how thick it is behind the edge, it's going to get dramatically bigger. So even if, like, I guess where I'm going with this, because there's a couple different ways I'm going with this. If you measure an edge behind, or a thickness behind the edge, so how thick the edge bevel is directly behind the edge, right there at the very top of the edge bevel. If you measure that, let's say it's really thin because they actually got down to a very thin edge, but it's a thick blade stock. So that means it's going to get thick quick. Just because it's extremely thin behind the edge with the factory edge that's 25 degrees per side doesn't mean that that's technically the thickness behind the edge, because you're most likely going to sharpen it, or you're going to have to sharpen it, especially if you want the knife to perform better than it is from the factory. Now, a lot of people might not care about this, but when you want your knife to perform, and eventually all knives will need to be sharpened, unless if you don't use them, but any knife that gets used. So when you sharpen it, now let's say you decide, okay, I want to do 17 degrees per side instead of 25 degrees per side. Well, now the edge bevel just got bigger. It went from, say, let's just say this big to this big. Now you're up into a part of the grind that is a lot thicker. So where you thought that knife was 10 thousandths behind the edge, in reality it's 20 thousandths behind the edge. And you're removing steel too when you do sharpen a knife. Now, so I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we can be, I'm not going to say misguided, but off just a little bit about what we're perceiving as the behind the edge thickness. In many cases, it's great. Like when you're looking at like say, let me pull up this knife, this element, this civivi Elementum button lock, this is going to be the same thickness behind the edge for a while because it's a hollow grind. And so it's like 15 thousandths behind the edge even after I sharpened it, right? So now some knives even with flat grinds. So let me pull up a flat grind. Doesn't matter. Like even this one has pretty decent geometry. So even after sharpening it, it didn't get much thicker because the geometry is really good. So, but when we get into knives that are a little thicker behind the edge, like let's look at this one. This one's a pretty thick blade stock. So, and it doesn't have far to drop. So this thing is very thick behind the edge. So now if you look at that little tiny edge bevel, you might think that thing's thin because it has such a little tiny edge bevel, but you don't know that that's sharpened 25 degrees per side. So now once you sharpen it for the first time, that edge bevel is going to get dramatically thicker. And that's even if you keep the, I mean, not if you keep the same exact angle, but if you drop it a little bit, it's going to get thicker. If you remove any steel from this, it's going to get dramatically thicker because it automatically starts getting thicker right away. Especially with this kind of flat grind. So now if you decide, well, this thing's thick or it's a little more thicker than you would like for this edge bevel. So you decide, I want to put 17 degrees per side or 15 degrees per side. Now you've laid that edge back and now your edge bevel's really big. So instead of measuring right here, you're going to wind up measuring right there behind the edge. Your edge bevel, you're going to be measuring it a lot higher up the blade. So the perception of it being, say, 15 thousandths behind the edge, or even 20 thousandths, whatever the measurement is, with that edge bevel, it gives you a perception that the geometry might be better than it is. Like even this knife right here. This knife has a pretty thick grind actually, but it's thin behind the edge. This is the twosun TS319, 319. Awesome knife. I love the knife. Got a review coming very soon. Love the acoustics. But the grind on it, it's somewhat tall. I mean, it's not a really tall grind, but it's basically a full flat grind. I mean, it does have the flat portion up here, but it's pretty much a full flat grind. So the geometry could be really good on this. But if you look, you can see it's not. You see how thick this is? Look at the taper down to the edge. It is not. This is not great geometry. This is thicker geometry, more robust. Does it mean it's bad? Not at all. Just because it has more robust geometry does not make it bad, does not mean it's not going to cut well. Because you can have robust geometry that'll still push through materials really good based on the ergos, the leverage you get, and how the taper actually is. How good is the taper? Is it a slow taper or is it a rapidly fast taper? So this one being a little bit taller is a little bit slower taper, especially when we compare it to, say, something like this. See how much shorter the edge bevel is compared to how tall this one is? So this one is dramatic. It only has from here to get thin. This one has from here to there. So a little bit thicker, but this is relatively thin behind the edge. When you measure it behind the edge, it's like 12 thousandths or something like that. Maybe a little bit thicker. But after sharpening it, and I put 15 degrees per side on it, or 17 degrees per side, it's going to get bigger. And then my edge thickness is probably going to be around 20 thousandths behind the edge on this. So, and to be honest, even though twosuns come with really good edges, some of the sharpest factory edges I felt, and not, I don't want to say I've felt a lot of good factory edges. I'm just going to say twosun does usually some pretty decent factory edges, you know, but their angles aren't really low or anything like that. They're usually about 22 degrees per side. But being 22 degrees per side, I personally want a lower angle than that, and that's definitely going to make it cut better. But it can just give you the perception that it's thinner. Now, a lot of cases, I have a lot of twosuns that are very thin behind the edge, and the measurement behind the edge thickness is going to stay that thickness because there are a lot of twosuns that actually have flat grinds that are made to sharpen. Literally, like let's pull up this one right here. This one right here, amazingly thin behind the edge. This is amazing geometry. Now you can even see it when we look right there. You can see how thin it is behind the edge. Now look at that taper. I can sharpen that a few times before it's really going to get much thicker. So it's going to stay basically the same thickness behind the edge, even if I lay this back to 17 thousandths behind the edge, or sorry, 17 degrees per side. Sorry guys, probably got you guys all confused. 17 degrees per side, my edge bevel, my edge angle, it's still going to be right around the same thickness, maybe a little bit thicker, you know, maybe it go from say 12 thousandths, or I forget what this is. I think it's around 10, 12 thousandths behind the edge to maybe 14 thousandths or 13 thousandths or something like that. But it doesn't dramatically get up to 20 thousandths behind the edge just because I sharpen it once. Now, when we look at knives like say the manix, for one, Spyderco's usually sharpen theirs. They're one of the companies that actually give you a pretty good edge angle from the factory. I think they're about 15 degrees per side with a 20 degree micro bevel. I think that's what it is, maybe 22 degree micro bevel. But since this is a tall grind, even though this is in the medium range, it's not robust, but it's not also ultra sharp or ultra slicey. I think the regular one is 130 thousandths spine thickness, and then behind the edge thickness is like 18 to 20 thousandths. Now their tips are known for being, you know, breakable, I guess you could say, because they, you know, the way they taper from the spine. So the thickest point is back here, and then it tapers down. It's thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner all the way down to the tip. So that's why they're at their tips, because they don't have any reinforcement behind the tip. They can possibly be a little brittle. But for the cutting geometry, you know, you can pretty much leave their same edge angle, and yes, it's going to get thicker behind the edge, but you can get a good sharpening or two out of it because you're basically going to put the same angle that's already on there. So you're not having to go that far back up the blade, because if I sharpen this again, right, I'm basically, this needs to be sharpened at this point. So, but it was really nice when I first got it done. I've just used it a lot, but I'm going to start my edge bevel right here at the same point. So I'm only going to basically remove edge right, or steel right at the very apex. So it's not going to get much thicker. Now, when we look at this knife, I just sharpened. Okay, this has medium range geometry. Now I'm testing the edge because I'm testing the steel, but I did lay back the edge a little bit. It's a little dirty. I did lay back the edge angle a little bit. Now, because of the way the geometry is, it really didn't get that much thicker. Pretty decent. But because the edge angle was actually smaller than the edge bevel I put on here, it's still thicker. Just not dramatically, but it is still thicker. So the measurement I would have had from the factory edge is definitely different than what it is now. Now, knowing this about a knife, when you get it, you can kind of determine or appreciate the grind for its use and how it's going to last, how it's going to sharpen, how much thicker is it going to get, how's the geometry going to be, because you're definitely going to sharpen it if you're going to use it. Now this knife right here is Megaron knives. I like Megaron knives. I think Megaron's doing a good job. This is a Megaron knife too, which is available, by the way. The Valero is the name of it. It just dropped yesterday. The Valero. So, but where I'm going with this is their edges aren't the best. They're just not. A lot of factory edges are not. There's some that are good, some are great, some are bad. Theirs are one of the ones that are not that great. So they also sharpen their knives at like 25 degrees per side. You can see how tiny this edge bevel is. Now, this is not thin behind the edge. This is a more robust knife. You can see the grind. Look how thick it is. Now, it's very tall, so it's going to perform. But specifically behind the edge, it's actually kind of thin right here, but it gets thick quick. So since it gets thick quick, when you put a 25-degree edge bevel right here, it gives you the perception that it's thin behind the edge if you measured it right here, rather than right here where it's actually going to be at after a good sharpening or after you put a proper edge bevel on it. Because like I said, they don't do good edges. So it's not going to be long before you want to sharpen one of these. One, they're not the best edges. First of all, yes, you could strop it, you could hone it and make it a lot better. You can make it last longer before you actually put an edge on there, but eventually you're going to need to put an edge because they don't come that good. They come, one, not acute, so their edge angles are very high, right? Instead of very low, they're very high. So that takes away sharpness right there. And when you decide to change it, because you say, I don't like this, isn't that sharp, I want to change it, I want to get it nice and acute, or I want a lower angle put on it, bam, you put the lower angle on it. Now all of a sudden your edge bevel is up to here or higher, and it's that thick behind the edge now. So instead of measuring right there at this little tiny portion, that's why this edge bevel is so small. So small because it's such a high angle. But once you sharpen it and put a low angle on there, bam, the edge bevel's up there and you're measuring right there behind the edge thickness. Now, just because I say that, I'm not saying when you grab a knife, measure all knives up there. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that depending on the geometry it has and the edge angle that it has, you might want to look at that. And I'm not saying measure it. I'm just saying look at it. You know, you can look and see, like, is this a robust grind? Or is this a finer grind? Does it dramatically get thick behind the edge? Because if so, well, then I need to look at that knife as a knife that, one, when I put an edge on it, the edge bevel is going to be bigger. And two, it's going to be that thickness behind the edge after sharpening. Now, I'll pull this back up here in 1 second, like this one, right? When you look at this, you can see how short the blade is. It's not tall, right? So you should already be perceiving that, since I'm saying it's a thick grind, that by putting a good edge bevel on this, that one, you're going to have a big edge bevel going across a little short knife. Now, yes, you do not have to do that. You can put a high angle down it. There's no problem with that. It'll be a tougher edge. It's not going to be as sharp. It's not going to cut as good. It won't get as good as edge retention, but it will be a little bit tougher and it'll still cut. Because that's another thing. You do increase a lot of performance when you lower the angle. Now, like this knife right here. This is the cold steel drop forged hunter and 52-100 steel. This thing came with, I'm not done sharpening it, but I did put a nice edge bevel, or I did a reprofiling on it. So I still need to go through some more stones, but I reprofiled it and you can see how flat the edge is and how high the edge bevel is. Look how big the edge bevel is. But when it first showed up, it needed a sharpening. First of all, it was very dull, but it had a very small edge bevel on there, which hinders the performance of this knife. And this knife can definitely handle, especially with this steel, a lower angle. So now, instead of, say, the edge thickness being right here, it's back here. So I hope you guys understand what I'm getting at and what I'm talking about. I see a lot of channels or people measuring thickness behind the edge, and I've seen people measure it and they'll be like, oh wow, this is very thin behind the edge, this is really slicey. And I might have the knife or have used the knife, and I know that knife has a robust grind. It is not slicey. So, but I just see people getting the perception, because it's thin behind the edge, that, oh, well, it's really slicey. No, the SOCOM Elite is 15 thousandths behind the edge. This is like 187 thousandths blade stock thickness. This is the exact opposite of good geometry. Yes, it's thin behind the edge, which does make it cut extremely better, a lot better than it would if it was 30 thousandths behind the edge. So that's amazing. Yes, it's going to cut a lot better than if it was thicker behind the edge, but it is not a great slicer. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's just a difference there. Yes, it's thin behind the edge, but it dramatically gets thicker like an axe. That's a good way to look at it. I love you guys. Hopefully you guys followed along. Oh, if you guys are interested in what these knives are, really quick, Civivi Brazen, Rake D191, the new Megaron Valero, CJRB Scoria. Oh man, I don't remember the name of this one. This one's a Megaron knife. You can find it on Megaron Knives if you go to their website, Megaron Knives. I forget the name of it. The Kizer Begleiter 2. twosun TS319. Spyderco Manix XL. twosun 301. Love this knife. Another Megaron, the Megaron Centurion. And then I already said the cold steel knife. All right, guys. Peace.